Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings, the podcast that gets you going before you get going.
Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings. I'm here as always with my co-host Vivi, and today we're going to talk about the book Bounce by Matthew Syed. So Matthew Syed was a former table tennis player and he was ranked as the top UK player for many years. And this book dives a lot into self-improvement and the power of practice. I'm sure you've all heard of the 10,000 hour rule. I believe it's coined by Malcolm Gladwell. And that rule is that in order to get peak performance or in order to get to the top of your field, your sport, your profession, you need to have 10,000 hours of purposeful practice. So this book is along the same theme. And one thing that Matthew talks about that I really found interesting was people having a fixed versus a growth mindset. So what this means is that some people believe that intelligence or athletic skills or musical skills are fixed. In other words, you're either born talented in certain areas or you aren't. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, there are some people that believe that things such as intelligence, athletic skills, or musical skills are actually transformed through effort. Now, you can probably tell which mindset is more likely to practice. If you have a fixed mindset, there really isn't much benefit to practicing because you likely believe it won't have much of an impact. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, there's a huge incentive to practice because that means you're going to get better. So I found this real interesting. They did a study with grade 5 and 6 students, and what they did is they gave questions about talent and intelligence in order to split up these grade 5 and 6 students and able to figure out which ones had a fixed mindset and which ones had a growth mindset. Afterwards, they were given difficult math problems. They were difficult for both groups. But now, those with a fixed mindset, they gave up earlier and they would blame themselves. They would say, oh, I'm not smart enough to do this, or I'm not good at this, I'm not good at math. But now, interestingly, those with the growth mindset, even though they tested for the same intelligence level as the other group, so they had the same math skills at that point in time, they ended up performing substantially better because they would try new strategies or stick with the problem longer because they believed that even though they couldn't do it now, they might be able to figure out if they kept trying. So people with a growth mindset, the study found, were more likely to try new challenges, while people with a fixed mindset weren't as likely because they were scared. They found out that if they weren't able to do something, then in a sense they would be losing their intelligence. They had more to lose because they thought their intelligence was tied directly to what they were able to do at that point in time. So I think the big takeaway for me was having a growth mindset really encourages you to pursue new challenges and to try and get better. And that's definitely one mindset I try and keep in mind whenever I find something difficult. And that while I might not be good at something right now, that doesn't mean it can't change.
And then on that note as well, Ryan, on the fixed versus growth mind state, it kind of also made me think of a lot of the points we've talked in the past about business strategies when business leaders or business owners are thinking about how they should be transcending their business into the next phase. Typically, people talk about the scarcity and abundance mind state as well. And that's very similar, I find, to this fixed and growth mind state talked about here in Bounce, where as in a scarcity mind state, people may be scared to do certain things in a business. For example, maybe you're trying to do something new in a business and you feel like, who am I to do that? Who am I to try and do that? And that might be a scarcity mind state, thinking, why should I, as an individual who has no experience, take that risk? And so you're scared a little bit about what's outside of the norm. Whereas the abundance mind state in business operations and growth is more so like, all right, I may not know everything. I may not know how to do everything. But what I do know is that if I try new things, I will explore and do new things. And so trying to have that same kind of mentality, even from when Matthew was going through his table tennis years, all the way through, even after maybe, to even then after into a career standpoint, that fixed mind state, I think, transcends easily to also a scarcity and abundance mind state. And I'd be curious to think that if when people are more on a growth mind state, maybe growing up as children, or from a curiosity standpoint from math tests and stuff like people had mentioned, that maybe that would transcend more into an abundance mind state later down the road in maybe business operations or your professional career as an employee or whatever the case may be.
The book talks a lot about talent versus hard work, and that there's so many things that you think are fixed, but you can actually learn. So one example it gives that I found really interesting was memory, and how your memory isn't something that's fixed. It's actually something you can grow with practice and with techniques. And so one example they gave was the technique of batching. So there was one man who was trying to, I think he said the world record for amount of digits he could remember in his head. So they would just spout out like 5, 7, 2, 3, but it would be like 20, 30, 40 digits in a row, and he would just be able to repeat them back. But when he started, he can only remember the like 6 or 7 in a row, which I think is what the average person can do. But he used a technique called batching. And so if they said a digit, for example, like 0, 1, 5, 1, 2, 7, he wouldn't remember every single digit or every single number. He would batch it together. And now he used to be an amateur runner. So for him, it was easy to remember running times. So he would just pretend that every time was like a 5K time or a 10K time. Kilometers. So for you in the States, miles. But and then it'd be a lot easier for him to remember. And so an example of this is, say it's not numbers but letters. If I spit out the letters like V, T, I, O, N, T, O, M, I, A, it might be pretty hard to remember. But what if we're able to batch it together somehow? I'll just rearrange the letters and do M, O, T, I, V, A, T, I, O, N. And then if you guys are kind of following along, you can see that spells motivation. So of course you can remember those letters in a row, even though it's the same amount, but all you're doing is you're batching it together to remember one big thing instead of 7 or 8 little things. So that's one thing I found really interesting. And then what they did is they actually tested people's memories who are known to have really good intelligence or memory. So one example was these math prodigies. They took these math prodigies who were amazing at math, could do amazing math problems, and they pitted them against cashiers that were at their job for over 14 years. So when the math problems were very high numbers, the math prodigy students or people did way better than the cashiers. But as soon as they made the numbers to digits that the cashiers would actually use at their job, and if they do like multiplication problems, the cashiers were actually faster than these so-called math prodigies. And the reason they figure was because, well, these cashiers have been doing their job for so long, they've just had the practice of doing this math in their head over and over and over again, kind of showing that it's not really what you're born with, it's how much are you practicing it. Another example is they took the memory of chess grandmasters, so people really the top in the world in chess, and what they did is they drove a truck down the road, so they had a few seconds to glance at the truck, and on the truck would be a chessboard with different chess pieces, and they would test these grandmasters, the memory of the grandmasters, against the memory of normal people. So when they did normal chess patterns, the grandmasters were always better, substantially better. They could always remember it pretty much. But what they did was really interesting. The next set of tests, what they did is they switched the patterns, so they weren't normal chess patterns. They were just totally random and things that wouldn't actually be able to happen in the game. Now when the truck came across, these chess grandmasters, they were no better at remembering what was on the truck than the average person. So again, you can see here, this memory is something you train and you practice, and you can get better using different techniques such as batching. So I found that really interesting.
Another point that I wanted to discuss, Ryan, and kind of goes towards the end of my points, but was with when Nicholas Humphrey from the London School of Economics talks about placebo. Now, obviously, as an economist, he thinks of the world and how to innovate new things and how that relates to the markets and etc. However, I didn't find that necessarily so thought-provoking as opposed to this point that he mentioned, which was to discover a new placebo, all you need to do is invent it. And for me, that kind of hit home. Like, it seems super easy. Yeah, of course, you want to have something new, like, just invent it. But if you think about just the placebo effect in general, so let's think about that. So placebo is a way that we measure ourselves relative to quote unquote nothing. That's what we think placebo means, nothing. So when we look at trials, for example, vaccine trials at the moment, you want to look at them relative to placebo. So does this vaccine do more than quote unquote nothing? However, what we've learned recently is that placebos in itself have effects on treatment. And so now we're starting to reinvent and having to think about what should we actually be comparing treatments to in maybe medicine. However, that's also fine and dandy for healthcare, but what about real life? In reality, placebo can be just any mind state or thought process you have on how something should be done. Maybe it's an organizational process that you are dealing with because you're a new employee. Maybe you don't agree with it. Maybe you do. But if you don't, how about discussing what maybe options you have to alleviate or get along or get past that maybe barrier? So all maybe you have to do is suggest a new way of approaching a situation to the management. Maybe you're starting your own startup, and maybe that's what all you have to do is, how do we change or shift the paradigm just a little bit by thinking outside of the box? Now, changing your beliefs, though, to be able to find a new placebo or a new baseline or a new procedure or a new way of doing things, that's the hard part. Because beliefs don't get changed overnight. You have to believe something for it to become something you can do. You have to be convinced in your mind that it can be done before you put it into action. Therefore, that statement alone I find very deep and thoughtful, even though it is simple. To discover a new placebo, or to discover a new way of thinking, or a new way to do something, all you have to do is invent it. All you have to do is invent it. So just encourage you guys, maybe try to have a little bit more of that mentality, a little bit more of a maker mentality. How can you make something that is putting up a barrier in your life? And how can you maybe invent something new so you can try and ameliorate that barrier? Another last point before we kind of sign off today was the thought that this book brought about irrational beliefs. And it had an interesting point about irrational beliefs. Talking about it, it said irrational beliefs can boost performance as long as they are met with great conviction. So what does that mean? Let's say you're at a random new company, just started, and now you want to boost the performance by having irrational belief relative to what's normally done. Now, the only way to do that, this book says, is to have great conviction that that's the path forward. If you're like, hey, man, every way, like for example, let's say you were trying to start a company like Facebook way back in the day, and you're like, hey, this is the new way. This is the new way we connect. This is the new way we talk to our family. This is the new way we interact. This is the new way employers look us up before hiring us. This is the new way, et cetera, et cetera. That is fantastic to believe that, but unless the founders of the companies had great conviction that that was the path forward, it really doesn't really matter what they thought. So just kind of a good thought process on irrational belief sometimes can boost performance as long as you meet that irrational belief with great conviction. So don't be afraid to think about a little bit irrationally outside of the box, as long as maybe that can have a net positive output in your life. And that wraps up today's episode at Motivational Mornings. As always, this podcast is sponsored by Audible. So if you want to get your first 30-day free trial of an audiobook, any book of your choice, feel free to pick that up at audibletrial.com/motivational mornings. And as always, thank you guys so much for listening, and have a great day.